Tell me, Bryan, how and why did charter schools get started in the United States?
Charter schools in the United States were started by progressives who were looking for alternatives outside of the public school system, ways that they could bring in communities, bring in educators, and importantly, bring in progressive ideals about child-centered education, and show best practices that could be modeled and then brought back to the public school system.
Why wouldn't you want to do a child-centered progressive education? There must have been something wrong with the public system. What was wrong?
Well, there are a lot of things that about the public system that I think people have found problems with over the years. Feeling like there's a lack of a feeling of community in the schools. Schools pushing out students or expelling students instead of finding ways to reach out to them. Schools alienating parents who speak other languages and not accommodating those languages or reaching out to them.
So they were all good things. Why are you against charter schools?
Right, except I'm opposed to charter schools because charter schools aren't doing those things. And charter schools, crucially, are a wedge, an attempt to create a school system that will erode the public nature of schooling in the United States. I'm not opposed to any particular school that happens to have the name charter on it because of what may or may not be happening inside that school. There are charter schools where there are things happening in the school that seem highly problematic, but there are also public schools where there are things happening inside the school that are problematic. The question is, what is the nature of the system as a whole, and what's the best way to set it up for all students? And unfortunately, once you move into a highly privatized choice, free market model, then the problem is that it's not really the parents and students who do the choosing, it's the schools. And that's what we see happening with the charter school movement. They choose their students largely through many different mechanisms. The lottery is a mechanism of choice. Applications in English only is a mechanism of choice. Counseling out students with special needs, students who have what we call here IEPs, individualized education plans. Students who would be more expensive to educate, they say, well, we can't offer you those services, and they encourage those families to leave the school. Students who have low test scores. So the charter schools pit themselves in this explicit competition with the public schools and kind of make their bones, make a name for themselves as outperforming quantitatively on test scores public schools. That's their claim to fame, that's their badge of honor.
How do they make their money?
Well, charter schools receive public funding. Many of them often do quite a bit of fundraising. In New York City, some of the most widely touted charter schools, or the biggest name charter schools, have funding and support from some of the wealthiest people on the planet. People like Stanley Druckenmiller, who's a billionaire, one of the wealthiest men on earth, and is a supporter of the Harlem Children's Zone here in New York City. Or Goldman Sachs, the investment bank, is also a supporter of the Success Academy chain of charter schools that's spreading throughout New York City.
So what's attractive to those to charter schools to those people? Why aren't they putting the money into the public system?
Well, I don't want to speak on their behalf, but certainly it seems like there's a number of things at play here. One, there's ideology. People like Druckenmiller openly say that he's a Republican. He's in favor of deregulation, of privatization. He's against the idea of a public service that's universalistic, just serving all comers and whoever crosses the threshold. He's in favor of a privatized system. I think also...
So there's a political ideology involved.
There's a political ideology, certainly, that's about privatization. I think also this is a sort of philanthropy that flatters those people and says to them that making schools more in their image, in the image that is of a very strong management, of a corporate board. You know, the schools, the leaders of the schools don't call themselves head teacher, they call themselves CEO. And so literally remaking schools in their own image flatters them that, well, this worked for Target, this worked for Walmart, therefore this must be the way to remake schools and make them work. The problem must be that the schools have this public nature, that the workers in the schools have collective bargaining, have say, that the schools have democratic governance boards with parents on them. That must be the problem, instead of, CEO smarties who are playing with the numbers.
So there are no boards of parents running these charter schools?
No, the charter schools are run by private boards. For example, the members of the board of the Harlem Children's Zone are all bankers, corporate executives, people in advertising. There's only one educator on the board, and that's the head of the school, the CEO of the school, Jeffrey Canada.
So it's a business model
Definitely.
applied to education.
Mm-hmm.
There must be up and downsides to that.
Sure.
Presumably the upside is you get more money thrown at the school, therefore you
Absolutely.
get more computers, those sorts of things,
Sure.
whatever you need.
Sure.
The downside is what?
The upside of having lots of resources is huge. And I think it's somewhat downplayed by the charter school movement, because the implication is, well, we need lots of resources to make school great. Well, that's what we've been arguing about the public schools for decades. So I feel like there's a contradiction there. On the one hand, they're saying we're better than the public school system, but on the other hand, they're making these improvements on the basis of tremendous resources.
Can I just, something that I'm finding curious.
Mm-hmm.
In the early days, these schools began because there wasn't community involvement.
Mm-hmm.
Now they don't involve the community at all. It's about making $1, is it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's important to qualify the thing about making $1, because it's not all charter schools are a direct money-making scheme. There are for-profit charter schools. It seems like where the profiteering comes in with the nonprofit charters is, first of all, exorbitant salaries. You have charter school leaders of not-for-profit charter schools here in New York City who have a few thousand students and make $500,000, more than the chancellor of 1 million students, of all of the students of New York City makes. So you have exorbitant salaries. You can pay yourself whatever you want to be the CEO. And certainly the charter school movement in general brings in the possibility of money making on the side through contracts. You contract somebody to clean the school. You contract with somebody else to feed the students. So there are side contracts.
And what, you try to cut costs there?
You maybe try to cut costs. You certainly cut costs in many places with teacher salaries, or with using less certified teachers, or just cycling through new teachers.
Talk to me about that. It's in charter schools. Is it generally that they use less qualified teachers? Are they looking to pay less to teachers in charter schools?
In general, the pattern is that by grinding through successive waves of new teachers, you avoid any teachers maxing out a pay scale. So some of them even will pay more, but they're only paying you for a few years on the idea that you're going to leave and do something else in 3 or 4 years. So there's a constant churn of new teachers. Nobody's maxing out the pay scale. Nobody's collecting retirement. Nobody's trying to have a family or take vacations or that sort of thing.
Except for the CEO.
Naturally.
The turnover on CEOs is
Naturally.
great.
But let me introduce to you another problem of all of this kind of corporate and hedge fund money being in education, which is that, for example, my public school in East Harlem was threatened with a co-location and became co-located. That is, to a public school, we were a public school, and then a charter school moved into our building, into empty space in the building. So we're both located in the same public school building. That charter school, which was one of the Success Academies, which is a chain run by Eva Moskowitz, we found out through the Daily News that that academy was spending north of $1 million a year on advertising. So they have, parents would come to me complaining. Our school's parents were getting these glossy brochures in the mail and saying, how did they get my address? Why have I gotten one of these a week? And we were looking at them thinking, where are they getting the money for all of this? So it's something like $1,000 per student they're spending. Then my principal turned to me and asked me if I could produce a brochure for our school. I mean, because that's the thing about competition. It imposes a symmetry on the competitors. So then the public schools are forced to act like the charter schools. They have uniforms, we have uniforms. They have glossy ads, we have to have glossy ads. But then we're scrimping, then I as a teacher am taking my time, instead of focusing on lessons and instructions, now I'm trying to figure out advertising. Or are we supposed to set aside an office in the school and instead of having it be a room for who knows what, we'll turn it into the advertising department of the school?
There's a central problem here, isn't it? It's the conflict between competition and cooperation. When I was a teacher, it was all about cooperation, cooperating with other teachers, cooperating with other schools,
Right.
to try and collectively
Right.
deliver the best education to
Right.
all our children.
Right.
What I'm seeing in this is a competitive model
Yes.
in which resources are going
Yes.
to non-teaching things, really.
Right.
Look how clever we are. Look
Yeah.
how brilliant we are.
Yeah.
Tell me, there are some suggestions in New Zealand that we should have pay incentives for good teachers.
Right.
Now, there's a couple of areas there, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
How do you decide what's a good teacher?
Well, in the United States, we have a thing called the value-added model, where they are trying to quantify the value that each teacher adds to, frankly, the test scores of his or her particular set of students. So it's once again brings us back to tests as the coin of competition. They're already the coin of competition between schools. Which school has the highest test scores? But now they're also trying to make it the coin of competition between teachers.
Do you publish those test scores, those results from schools?
Yes, the results are published for every school. And increasingly, well, a few years ago, they published the value-added score of every teacher in New York City. They were published and released to the public.
And do teachers get paid differently depending on their value added?
What they've tried to do is pilot in some schools attempts to pilot programs where groups of schools or individual schools elected to try out this model and see how it works. The problem is there's lots of research in the United States showing that it has never worked, basically, and that it continues not to work. Because the premise is that somebody's just not really giving it their all until we dangle $5,000 in front of them, and then they'll those kind of performance incentives generally work for very straightforward, dull, repetitive tasks. Sure, you can give somebody a material incentive and they'll run on the treadmill a little faster. But for very complex work like teaching that requires thousands of decisions a day, that requires empathy, thought, planning, decision-making, creativity, and a high degree of intelligence and judgment, you can't just dangle quantities of money and get more of all of those things out of a person. Actually, the best way to get all of those, to have a teacher perform at a higher level, you have to empower the teacher. And that's the thing that the corporate types don't want to do. That insults their view of how the world should work. Their view of the world is that you get great results when you have a great leader and everybody else does what they say. And the more dictatorial and the more power concentrated at the top, the better the performance will be of everybody below them.
You've also had some fairly spectacular examples of cheating.
Yeah, of course. Well, look, if you say the student's future is going to depend on this test, and not only that, the teacher's future is going to depend on the test. And then not only that, the administrator's future is hanging on that test. And we're not going to stop there. The school's future is hanging on that test. Well, then, shockingly, you're going to have some people who are going to decide to figure out a way to cut corners on that test. I mean, if everything is riding on that. And so we've distorted all out of proportion the idea of measurement of teaching and learning. It's no longer a measurement of teaching and learning. It's everything about teaching and learning is getting students to jump through that particular hoop.
Okay, I'm going to go back over a couple of things, but it's a slightly different way. Like Democracy School that we'll be visiting tomorrow, say that they have produced better motivation in their students, they've got a much more personalised view about how to go about this. Why shouldn't they run their school?
Well, look, I don't want to begrudge anyone their success in a school. If there is some school where they're genuinely doing fantastic things and creating, as you say, genuine motivation in an individual student and a love of learning, and students are happy and things are going well, why would I begrudge anyone their success in that? That's what we should all be for. The problem is, I feel like there's a catch-22. If that is in fact what's happening, then why won't we turn around and set up similar conditions in all of the public schools? If it requires the kind of tremendous resources and fundraising that these privatized schools are getting, then why won't we lavish the public schools with those same resources and attention? And on the other hand, if that's not happening, then if there's another story, if there's something else going on, or if that sphere is able to exist because of who's being eliminated, of who's kicked out or counseled out of that school, or who's not allowed to attend, if there's some other part to the story, then I think we have to look more carefully. And in many celebrated schools, when you look more closely, that's the story. It's a story of attrition. It's a story of a class that starts off with 100 kids and by graduation has 40. And it's like, yay, everybody graduated. Well, yeah, everybody graduated who graduated, and you don't even count the other students who've successively been counseled or kicked out of the school over the years.
So, if I can feed back to you what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
The charter schools breed a kind of elitism.
They can. Mm-hmm.
That, children with special needs aren't going to get in.
Yes.
If you've got some disability or a learning disability, or that your grades aren't going to make the school look good, then you're going to go to the public school, and then the public school's not going to look that good because they have to take these kids. But I'm wondering whether at core there is an issue of fairness. Do we believe that every child in your country or in my country has an equal opportunity to an exciting education, that it should be fair? Is there an unfairness about charter schools?
Well, certainly, because you are taking students and lavishing attention and resources on them in a way that you're not doing to their neighbors. So sometimes you have in the same school building a public school which may have a crumbling infrastructure, which may have old flooring or needs new paint and needs to be fixed up and the windows are leaking. And then a charter school will move into the building, and thanks to Goldman Sachs, have new everything, new windows, new track lighting, potpourri in the bathroom, new carpeting at all. Okay, so if we're saying that, if the message there is that kids need a clean, attractive, bright environment to feel at home and to have a fantastic learning experience, then shame on us for not doing that in the public school system. And what are we communicating by allowing these two schools to stand right next to each other? Now, I'm not saying that the other school, in terms of its methods, is necessarily a better school, but there's certainly things that are going on there that are not helpful, that go against the spirit of a kind of universalistic aspiration, that we're going to take all comers, that we're going to treat all souls, that we're going to work with students no matter their ethnicity, no matter their disability, no matter their language.
You see, I suspect we're going to a school tomorrow that is a divided building. On one side, I think there's a public school, and on the other side is this charter school. Well, first of all, I find that odd. But I don't get it, I'm sorry, why Goldman Sachs would want to put money into a school. What's in it for them?
Well, again, I don't know that necessarily there is a direct profit, per se, for Goldman Sachs. I have found no evidence of that. So certainly there's ideology we can understand of wanting to be a part of, wanting to be on the ground floor of privatizing the school system.
Is it about saying that, sorry to interrupt, but is it about saying that we want to have an education system that produces students for the economy? Do they have a say in the curriculum? Do they have a say in what a child is actually going to learn? Is there a difference in the curriculum of a public school and a charter school? Help me out here.
In my experience, and again, this is not as a charter school teacher, but just as an observer of charter schools, in some of the most celebrated charter schools, what you see is an extreme version of some tendencies that we see already in the public schools, and that is an embrace, a full embrace of the logic of high-stakes standardized testing, and therefore kind of opening the sluices to competing on that basis. And that means If you have to spend the whole year preparing for the test to the exclusion of nearly everything else, that's what you're going to do. If you have to kick out kids who are low test scores, then that's what you're going to do, to chase those numbers. So in terms of what the teaching and learning looks like, reports that we get all the time from charter school teachers are that, yes, there is an extreme emphasis on test preparation in those schools. And so then what does that mean for students who go through that education? Well, that's not dissimilar from students who are graduating from high school now have had 12 years of what we call No Child Left Behind in the United States. That is a very test-centric curriculum. Like, you are going to learn how to answer these tests. So those are students who've done precious few, by senior year of high school, have done precious few genuine projects, genuine inquiry-based learning, genuinely following their own intellectual questions and learning how to research them, find their answers, and evaluate them. Precious little of that, and a lot of making sure you can hit these numbers on this standardized bubble test.
We've got a similar situation, haven't we, with the OECD and the PISA tests. You can teach to the test and you can get yourself up in the rankings. But are you teaching critical, analytical thinking, those sorts of things are real issues, aren't they? Tell me,
can I just
yes,
suggest
please.
that there might be a connection between that kind of test-focused curriculum and the new economy, the kind of neoliberal economy? I think you're onto something there with that. The connection may be that by teaching students from the earliest grades, even they tried to introduce this year in New York City high-stakes standardized tests for 4- and 5-year-olds, right? Tests where the stakes, just to be clear, were going to be the evaluation of their teachers. So you're going to sit little 4-year-olds down to take a bubble test in order to evaluate their teachers. And I think what you teach students with that, the lesson, the subtext of that, is that, hey kid, we're going to quantify your performance all through your life, so get used to it now. Keep your numbers up, okay? Because that's how you're going to be treated when you go to work at McDonald's, when you go to work at Walmart, when you go to work anywhere. We're going to have real-time performance data for you. And you better learn to live and die by the numbers, because that's the way the world works. That's the way Goldman Sachs makes its money. That's the way Walmart makes its money. That's the way UPS makes its money. Real-time data, big data sets, real-time, and following the numbers. That is the magic of the internet. That's the magic of Google. That's algorithms. So all of these people are getting fantastically wealthy, revolutionizing the world on that basis. And I think they have the idea that school needs to be revolutionized on the same basis. We need micro data on student performance. Bill Gates even wanted to put, Bill Gates of Microsoft fame, wanted to put wristbands on students to see if their wrist activity could tell us minute to minute how attentive they were or engaged they were in a particular lesson in a school. So they are after ways to quantify what's going on in school, create data sets, and be able to sit at a computer screen and watch the numbers and know how education is going. That's what they aspire to do.
Tony, that's what we, in the 19th century, the time
Bryan.
and motion studies people did.
We'll
work out, we'll run a clock on you to see how you can do this particular piece of putting some widget together, and then we'll figure out how you can do it faster.
Yes.
That is extraordinary, I have to say, that it is, we're down to that, because I'm going to ask you a question. When you were a public school teacher, what did you try to do with children? What was your aim?
My aim was to help them to realize their own powers, their own intellectual and creative powers. I feel like in my education, there were teachers who came along and pointed things out to me about myself and said, oh, that's an interesting idea. You should pursue that. Or, oh, look, notice how you're good at this. Oh, why don't you try to do more of that? And they helped me realize things that I might try, or they helped me learn about myself. And so I thought, well, here I am, a teacher in Central Harlem, starting out. I thought, all of my students have their own particular genius, and my job should be to try to bring it out, try to help them nurture it, to find it, to put their finger on it. What are you interested in? What are you passionate about? And let's go with that. That should be the challenge of an educator, somebody who's looking at students and treating them like human beings who develop at different rates, who develop in different ways, who have widely different abilities and talents and intelligences. The problem with standardization is that students aren't standard, and neither are teachers. Kids don't come in standard ways to you.
The other area I wondered about too when I listened to this, about, you must get through these tests, you must, this micromanagement of factual material. I mean, surely one of the things that we're trying to do with children is to provide them with the resilience and the skills that they will need to solve whatever life is going to throw at them in the 21st century. And we've got really no idea what kind of life and what things will change for these kids that are currently going through schools. But what we need to do, presumably, is to give them the kind of critical and analytical thinking, to be aware of their own, the kind of things that you just said, their own skills, their own abilities.
One of my friends who's a real inspiration to me, a teacher in Seattle named Jesse Hagopian, who led a protest movement and continues to lead a protest movement among teachers against the tests, the standardized tests. They even boycotted a test in one school where he was working 2 years ago. He said something that I think is very profound, which is that look at what we're facing, a global climate catastrophe, endless wars, extreme gaps of wealth. The solutions to these problems are probably not going to be found by bubbling in A, B, or C. In reality, it's not that we should get these kids to figure out how to answer a question the way that Pearson or McGraw-Hill would frame it. It's really that we have to get kids to figure out how to ask questions about the world and how to solve the big problems that we face, which is going to require more of them than our present instruments of measurement allow.
So what do you say to people who say, well, the reason you're frightened about tests is that you don't want to be accountable as a teacher?
Well, look, I think there can be lots of accountability. When I was teaching second grade, we frequently had parents, in many different grades that I taught, we frequently had parents come in and listen to the students read their writing or watch them perform a play that they wrote. If you want to know how the music teacher is doing, go hear the choir sing. Go hear the band play. Watch the kids play soccer, and that'll tell you something about the coach. I think it makes sense to have accountability that's more organic to the process of teaching and learning, and frankly, closer to it. In some ways, all of this testing is a power play. It's about removing accountability from the people who are close to the site of teaching and learning and making it people looking at computer screens hundreds, even thousands of miles away, judging what is being taught and learned, judging who shall advance and who shall be held back, judging which teachers are great and which ones are horrible at a great distance from any actual teaching and learning. Well, unfortunately, I wish this was just a local problem. I wish this was just a problem in New York City or just in the United States. But unfortunately, you can look nearly anywhere in the world right now, and there seems to be a trend, which you might call a global education reform movement, germ, that seems to be infecting the world. And I think that it is largely in line with what you might call neoliberal thinking. That is what we need to do, not just in education, but in healthcare, in every sphere of social life, is strip away any regulations, strip away any workers' protections or collective bargaining, or for working people involved in something to have any say in the process. Get rid of all of that and have all power concentrated with the CEOs, with the people in charge, and have things that used to be a kind of guaranteed universal service just provided. You walk through the door, you receive the service. You're eligible just for being here. Just for showing up and breathing, you're eligible for all of these things. Instead, they want to create in schools what they've already created in the United States in healthcare, and that is a market. And that seems to be the logic of it, to marketize and therefore commodify all of it. In the United States, we've seen this happen in some whole cities. It's already happened. It's already been accomplished. Like in New Orleans, for example, here, they took advantage of the flood of Hurricane Katrina to wipe away the public schools, to wash them away as well. And now we have an entirely marketized system. So if you're shopping for an elementary school, you're a shopper for that elementary school. You're a shopper. You're given a booklet of, I think it's 79 different schools that you have to look through and try to comprehend. And you have to try to, drive around to those schools and see them for yourself. I mean, it's a very difficult process. And what ends up happening is that instead of you choosing a school, it's really that the schools choose you. And so once again in New Orleans, we have a very stratified system. The wealthiest, and because this is America, the whitest students are concentrated in the highest performing schools with the most resources. Some of them are not even in the booklet. They're not even on the menu. You can't even apply to them. And the most economically deprived students who are living in poverty, and which, because this is the United States of America, means also usually darker skinned students in our city centers, those students are concentrated in the schools with the least resources and the most challenges and having the most difficult time.
So this is increasing the gap between the rich and the poor.
Yes.
So why is it that companies like Goldman Sachs would want to be involved in education?
Well, I think there's another angle here that we don't yet fully know down the road how it's going to play out, but certainly they are backing a play whereby charter schools in New York City get free rent in public school buildings. So they are getting free space. Now, in New York City, of course, you understand real estate's very expensive. So in some cities, we've noticed a pattern of neighborhoods that are being gentrified are often on the cutting edge of the kind of charterization and marketization of the public school system, and those things go hand in hand. So if you're kicking out the old residents, one of the ways to begin that process is by bringing in choice schools that can select their students and push out undesirable students. It's another way to push out the families. And so potentially also, if you are able to insert a private entity into a public space and then allow that private entity to grow and grow, because there's a question, if you have two elementary schools in the same building and the public school wants to add a 6th grade, but so does the charter school, well, you can't please both of those children. One has to be the favored child. And increasingly what we see is that the charter schools are allowed to expand at the expense of the public schools. So this is also a land grab and a real estate grab in New York City, the consequences of which I don't think are immediately apparent necessarily to everybody, but there's a long-term play going on here that has to do with reshaping the city as a whole.
The connection between land value and schools in New Zealand is obvious to anybody in New Zealand. But I'll talk about that. I have two questions. Is education a commodity or a right?
Well, it should be a right, but in the United States it's increasingly a commodity. In the public school system, any soul that crosses the threshold is entitled to the service. Whatever your language, whatever your ability level, whatever your needs, the premise is, I'm not going to say those needs are always met. I wish that they were in the public system. But in the public system, we have a premise. And the premise is that we are supposed to try to meet those needs. And we have some kind of democratic governance structures that allow, at least for the advocacy of the student, to get those needs met. The private system, and increasingly the charter schools, operate on a different premise. The premise is more like the premise of McDonald's or Burger King. No shirt, no shoes, no service. Like, we reserve the right to refuse you service. They don't have to serve you at McDonald's. They can bounce you out of there, right? Because it's a private entity. And so we're losing that universalistic aspiration in the charter schools. That's one of the problems. I want to, if I may, add another element into this that's important, and that's the element of racism in the United States. Because and this is perhaps one of the most confusing things about the charter schools, and part of the reason that they have so much liberal support, which is that the charter schools in films like Waiting for Superman have promoted themselves as vehicles of racial justice and have directly appealed to some of the communities that have been most underserved in the public school system. And so, for example, my experience as a teacher in Harlem was that not every family, but certainly there were a significant chunk of families who had an ear for the promises. I'm talking about especially African American families, had an ear for the promises of the charter schools. And the charter schools spoke the language, appropriate the language of the civil rights movement. And they say, you have been underserved. They name the problem. And they say, we're going to get you justice. We're going to get you the kind of education that you've been denied in the public school system. And so there's a kind of fake anti-racism going on that has had an appeal. And I think we have to recognize that part of the reason it has resonated with people is because of, in some cases, really bitter experiences in the public system. To me, that's a cry to reform the public system, not to abolish it and, in favor of privatization. So they've created for some parents in places like Harlem a real kind of Faustian bargain where they say, give up your democratic right to a universalistic institution, because what good has that gotten you? Instead, we're going to give you something better, a better product. And for people who came from a school where their child was suffering, or there was violence, or they felt like it was not a good environment, they might find, even with the emphasis on high stakes testing, or even with all, they might find that an improvement from this. They might experience this change as a dramatic improvement. So that's real. Of course, we also can tell other stories. Students who were miserable in a militaristic, hyper, no excuses type style school where you have to walk on this line, your pencil has to be in this quadrant of your desk, your eyes have to be on the teacher and tracking the teacher. I mean, we have students who've gone from that and were vomiting or were filled with anxiety at 5, 6, 7 years old, and went from that into a public school where they were nurtured and where they were able to be more successful. So we have opposite stories as well. But I think that it's important to recognize that here in the United States, that dynamic of race, frankly, is an important aspect of what's going on.
One last question, but a general question, really. What's an education for, anyway?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Increasingly, I think here in the United States, what's being argued for is a kind of utilitarian education to fit you into some particular type of job, instead of more education for life, instead of education that's about how we might help you realize your potential and help us collectively realize our potential. That might be less individualistic and more about what are our collective aspirations for people who live here.